Hey everyone, welcome to the most opinionated space podcast on the internet,
Ad Astra, the podcast where we talk about the intersection between space, policy, and technology.
I'm Jack.
And I'm Newton.
I have a master's of public policy degree with a concentration in science and space policy.
And I'm a PhD in computer science and an all-around tech geek.
All right, so we have completed the first ever t-shirt design contest for Ad Astra. So we had many thoughtful, endearing, wonderful submissions, but the three that we have picked are from friends of the show, Kevin Fellows, Sarah Perez, and our very own Tom Kelly.
Congrats,
so
guys.
Thank you all. Yeah, thank you all for submitting your wonderful designs. So we are going to be, as this episode is airing in your ears right now, we will be posting a place where you can vote on your favorite design. And from there, we will pick the winner, and the winner will get a 10-minute segment on the show, or 15. I can't remember what we decided on, but whatever the rules are, you get those things, plus the t-shirt, plus our undying gratitude.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, guys, for all of your entries. Make sure to go in and vote. Jack, tell them where they can go in and vote again.
I think we're going to do it on Facebook, but unless that changes, go to facebook.com/Ad Astra podcast and vote for your favorite design there. We're probably going to do one of those react to vote things.
Yeah. Once again, thank you guys again for your hard work on all of those designs. Moving on once again, and we're going to continue announcing this every week, and we have no idea when we'll stop announcing this, but make sure you go and donate to the victims of all of the recent hurricanes that have come through Texas, Florida, and all through the Caribbean. Once again, you can go to redcross.org, globalgiving.org, or airbnb.com/disaster in order to give money to directly benefit those people, or offer your homes to directly benefit the people that are homeless in those areas. Once again, that's the American Red Cross at redcross.org, globalgiving.org, or airbnb.com/disaster. Also, if you don't want to donate to any of those, there are a number of charities to donate to on FEMA's website. So once again, go to FEMA.gov and you'll be able to see those there. And so today on our show, we'll be talking about, in latest from Washington, the latest report from GAO with recommendations for FAA AST. In our space news highlight of the week, we'll talk about the first meeting of the National Space Council that was down in Udvar-Hazy last Thursday. In international news, we'll talk about the James Webb Space Telescope being delayed once again to spring 2019. In latest in tech, we'll have a little bit to say about the upcoming launch for the JPSS-1 satellite. And finally, incoming soon to space, well, you'll see. we'll see what happens by the end of the time that we're done recording here for coming soon to space.
Yeah, if our alarms start going off, yes. Just know that something really major has happened, and we will give you our live recording of us watching the trailer.
Live reaction.
Live reaction.
We'll see.
I won't even say what movie the trailer is for, because I am sure you, by this point, you probably have seen the trailer yourself, but this will be our live reaction. Yeah. If it happens while we're recording.
Without saying too much about that, because we can go on for an hour just talking about the trailer that we haven't seen yet. Let's get on to latest from Washington. The GAO releases this report with recommendations for FAA AST. So you plowed through this thing, Jack?
Yeah. So I know everyone is probably all fancying listening to us talk about the National Space Council hearing, but that we'll get to in a later segment. This GAO report, Government Accountability Office, is a very eye-opening report on some of the things, and almost gives some really good context to watch when you're watching the National Space Council footage. So definitely, if you can, read this, at least the executive summary or the letter to Congress that FAA or that GAO reports in this report.
That might get read on another podcast.
Yeah, you never know.
You never know.
But yeah, so definitely read this report before going into at least the second panel of the NSPOC meeting. But anyway, so the Government Accountability Office is an office within the legislative branch of government, meaning that it's separate from all of the other usual agencies and administrations underneath the White House. What GAO does is it takes solicitations from members of Congress about issues in their district, in their jurisdiction, on their committees, things of interest to them. Anything really that a member of Congress wants to know more about, they go to the GAO. The GAO then creates these reports based on these submitted questions, and they're a little bit less just factual. So the Library of Congress Congressional Research Service also does something like this, but those are more factual. That's like your encyclopedia.
It's data.
Definition
it's just straight up data.
Yeah, it's just the straight up data.
Yeah. This is more like these guys. That was unintentional, by the way.
It was subconscious.
It really was. Make sure you check out Straight Up Podcast. We'll have a new podcast up this week. But GAO is more like conducting audits in some respect. That's at least what I associate them with, is conducting audits, making sure that certain agencies or government entities are adhering to policies that they have in agreement with the government. Is that an accurate statement?
Yeah, and a lot of these policies are very nuanced and very difficult things to understand, even for a policy-minded person sometimes. So when the GAO comes knocking at your door, being someone who has worked on a project for GAO, I was not at GAO, but I was doing a project contracted out to us. If you say that you're with the GAO, the mood of the entire conversation changes, and they ask to bring in a lawyer. I mean, the GAO is a feared member of the U.S. government, but it is a very vital member of the U.S. government.
Absolutely.
As well.
It's a major check on a number of agencies within the government to make sure that they are doing what they are telling the people of the United States they're doing.
Yeah, and they often...
Yeah.
And with these reports, they often answer a very serious policy question. So in this report specifically, so the Federal Aviation Administration, the people that make sure your planes fly on time, has an office in it called the Office of Commercial Space Transportation. The acronym, the initialization of it is AST. Don't ask me why. It makes no sense. Why isn't it CST? Whatever. So FAA AST has been underneath the FAA since 1994, I want to say 1995, when a major policy shift. It was in the budgeting cycle for 1994 when they were deciding what they were going to spend in 1995. They moved AST into underneath the FAA. Before that, it was part of the Department of Transportation. FAA is part of the Department of Transportation, but AST was its own separate office. It was as independent an office as you can get while still being under the existing hierarchy of, say, something like Department of Transportation. And the office itself hadn't existed prior to 1985. So in those, the first 10 years it switched offices, and now we're about 22 years at this point in, and there is a lot of movement to move it back into a full office within Department of Transportation. So what this GAO report looked at was the stakeholder perspectives on what a move like that could mean for industry, for the government, and for civilians. So industry, as you'll hear in the NSPOC meeting, industry is very much in favor of streamlining the regulatory process for getting rockets into space. Right now, it's a pretty long wait process. You have to submit an application basically and saying, hey, I want to launch this rocket. I have access, because of NASA or Air Force, I have access to this launch pad. My my rocket has been rated, human ready or cargo ready or whatever you're launching has to be ready to do that. And then the FAA AST reviews it. FAA AST, I mean, you would think, I mean, with NASA having about $19 billion, that, you know, $1 billion would be a significant, you know, a good size for something as big as the regulators making sure these rockets are safe and are allowed to launch. Well, you'd be wrong in that assumption. The FAA AST is only 18 billion or 18 million as of 2016. So that is very small compared to everything else the federal government does. Right. So what industry wants to see is that this office both get an increase in funding as well as move into a more autonomous position within the Department of Transportation so that it can increase the communication and coordination within the Department of Transportation across all the different areas that space touches, streamline regulations, and be a better allocation of resources. The FAA in this GAO report argue the exact opposite, saying that removing AST from FAA is going to muddle communication, reduce coordination, regulations aren't necessarily going to get more streamlined, and resources are going to be duplicative at that, you know, duplicatively spent. So what this report basically says is that industry wants this, the government doesn't, or at least the government bureaucracy doesn't. What Congress does with this information is entirely up to them. We're past the point right now for the upcoming year for 2018 to see a major policy shift like moving AST out of FAA and into DOT proper. But what we could see is in the next couple years, we'll see an increase in spending on AST as the commercial spaceflight industry blooms. Within the next couple of years, you're going to have Sierra Nevada Corporation flying. Hopefully, they'll be flying human-rated vehicles. We're going to hopefully have Virgin Galactic, right? That's their new name, Virgin Galactic, or Virgin Orbit. Virgin Orbit is the new one. Hopefully, they'll be flying things soon. Blue Origin will hopefully be flying, and SpaceX will hopefully be flying the Falcon Heavy. And then our friends at ULA might have the Vulcan ready within the next 3 to 5 years. So what this GAO report indicates is that there is likely to be a policy shift within Congress or from Congress to change the way that commercial space transportation regulations are created and are implemented. If you look at both the Senate and the House version of the 2018, the fiscal year 2018 budget, which started this month, but because of a continuing resolution, they have it until December 9th, I want to say, is the cutoff. If they don't pass a budget or another continuing resolution, the government's going to shut down on December 9th, just in time for Christmas.
They're not going to shut down.
They're not going to shut down. I mean, they've given up on the whole wall thing. They've given up on...
Just so we're clear.
Yeah. Again, assuming the government doesn't shut down and they actually pass this budget, both the Senate and the House version give FAA AST $21.5 million. That's already about a $2 million increase over what they got in fiscal year 17, which is about 19.5 or 19.6. So we're already seeing a massive increase in funding. And I mean, on something of that scale, when you're only talking in the millions, $2 million is still quite a lot. I mean, that's, 10% of the entire budget increase, which is above inflation. Inflation increases are generally 3.5%. So yeah, I guess that's the long-winded answer to what this GAO report means. It just means that we're going to see something in the next 3 to 5 years that's going to move AST out from FAA and into its own office, which includes giving it its own office space. There's like the logistics of that is a consideration in this report that they talk about.
So it's a consideration. We don't know if it's actually going to happen.
Yeah, well, I mean, the GAO is very, 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 very thorough. And they talk about literally everything. They talk about everything from, what the major policy shift is down to, okay, how are we going to get this new office, like, staff and desks and coffee. Like they take everything into consideration in their cost benefit analysis. And what it seems like the GAO report shows that there's this division within the stakeholders, so Congress or the government bureaucracy that already exists in FAA and the industry groups. Congress tends to follow the industry groups a lot more because and especially with a Republican administration and a Republican House and Senate, they're going to be very much focused on the industry aspect of things. So I would say that it's almost certain that in the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to see AST move into DOT. Whether that's actually going to streamline regulations or improve communication, that's hard to say. That's like predicting the future. It's never certain. But it is going to create an environment in which industry knows that the government and specifically Congress is listening to their concerns and might make it easier for them to make decisions. That might be government contracts, or not contracts, but the government might not be as uncertain a variable in their major business decisions as it has been previously in the commercial space industry.
Okay. Well, we'll have to see what happens going forward with that. Next up in latest from Washington, well, it got transferred to our space news highlight of the week. So, was the NASA statement on the National Space Council policy for future American leadership in space. This was the first meeting of the National Space Council. It was a 2.5-hour meeting held last Thursday. That's September 30th, was that?
Nope, October 5th.
October 5th. My bad. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Last Thursday. Got to do it a week from the day after this airs. So just doing that math in my head. So it was a 2.5-hour meeting last Thursday. The big news was that the council accepted a recommendation from known paid protester and Vice President Mike Pence that the U.S. will, quote, lead in the return of humans to the moon for long-term exploration, followed by human missions to Mars and other destinations. That recommendation will be incorporated into a decision memo to be submitted to the President of the United States. So Pence also at the forum called on the Secretaries of Commerce and Transportation, along with the OMB director, to conduct a full review on our regulatory framework for commercial space to identify potential reforms to streamline operations. So they talked quite a bit about that. And that was, as we predicted last week, that commercial space would just be a very big part of this. And at the end of the meeting, the National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, said that the National Security Council was developing a space strategic framework to support American vital interests in space. So those were kind of the three big areas hit, were commercial space, humans to moon to Mars, and the national security and the national security strategic framework, which is going to be mostly classified. So, Jack, what were some of your first takes on this?
So just to reiterate what you said, there were 3 panels. There was the civil space panel, which was made up of Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and Orbital ATK. So you could view that as the old space panel, the old space companies. The next panel after that was the commercial space. So there you had Sierra Nevada Corporation, Blue Origin, and SpaceX, so the new space companies. And then at the final one was a national security, so you didn't have industry representation, but what you did have was representation of some folks. I'm trying to find the names on here.
Not necessarily industry representation, but industry representation sitting in on the meeting, because the people who are going to be building these national security frameworks are still going to be the old hats, the Lockheeds, the Northrops, so on, and the Raytheon, so on and so forth. You primarily had folks of the National Security Advisor and that ilk, for lack of a better term, making most of the speeches, bringing up the major topics, and most folks just sitting in and listening at that part of the forum.
So the whole, for all three panels, there was an audience, which included people like Newt Gingrich and Jim Bridenstine, two very prominent space advocates. Jim Bridenstine being the nominee for NASA administrator in the Trump administration.
One would hope he's a space advocate if he's
well, and
if he's up
we've
for
said
being
he is a very low level threat.
Yeah.
But yes, but I guess what was so different was that there was a lot of industry representation in the first two panels, and you would expect there to be some industry representation at the national security panel because, like, they are the ones that build these things.
Well, they're the ones that build it, but they don't guide it. The national security is very much so guided by the people that are appointed into those positions.
Yeah. Well, also, but on that note, I'm looking at the list right now. All of the folks that were on the final panel, the national security panel, all had former in front of their title. So you had Mike Griffin, which is a former NASA administrator and was around for the second National Space Council.
Yeah.
You had former Admiral James Ellis, who was formerly head of Strategic Command. And then we had Pamela Melroy, who was a former shuttle commander. The last two, Ellis and Melroy, both have current positions. They're fellows or directors of their own organizations. But Mike Griffin is entirely retired NASA administrator.
Here's an interesting point, though. At what time did each of these people serve?
They were all serving under the Bush administration, generally. Under the second Bush administration. Mike Griffin was the head of NASA from 2005 to 2009. He was the one preceding Charlie Bolden, but when he was involved with the second National Space Council from 1989 to 1993. I think that was the entirety of it. He was the executive secretary.
Oh, okay.
If I'm remembering that correctly, he was at least he was on staff for the second National Space Council. But yeah, so sort of on to what I saw. In more ways than one, I'm not surprised at the way that the cabinet members. So many people thought that they were just going to send like the aides, but like actually Elaine Cho, Rex Tillerson, Mike Pence, Robert Lightfoot, like you had about like 3/4 of the cabinet was there, including the vice president. So I was kind of hoping that there'd be a little bit more congruence between the panelists, so your Lockheed Martin representatives, your SpaceX representatives, and the National Space Council. But there seemed to be a very clear divide in what the panelists were saying and what the members of the Space Council were, I guess, hearing and responding to.
What do you mean?
So in particular, Mick Mulvaney, who's director of the Office of Management and Budget, he is the one that his office makes all the major funding decisions for the federal government. Not that he actually gets money to move around, but that he's the one that says, this is what we're prioritizing. This is where we're putting money. And I just remember he very clearly misheard the way that this was in the commercial space panel, and it was what from Blue Origin was something the representative from Blue Origin was saying was, they were talking about regulations for commercial space, and this kind of goes into our conversation earlier about FAA AST. The person from Blue Origin was basically saying, hey, we want more regulation. We want smart regulation. We just want you to like answer our questions. We don't like this sort of mystique of uncertainty that surrounds commercial space flight right now. There's a lot of things. I mean, for launching a rocket, there's certain regulations, and there's a whole nother set of regulations for landing a rocket. Why they're not part of the same regulation set as launching and landing rockets is probably going to be the way of the future. Why there hasn't been integration of that regulatory regime doesn't make sense to me, doesn't make sense to many in the space community. And that's what the representatives from all the companies we're talking about was, we want streamlining of these regulations, and they more or less said they want more of them. They want to know where their boundaries are. They want to know like what's correct, what's wrong. And Mick Mulvaney distinctly misheard that as saying they want less regulations. And he kept using the word streamline as if streamline meant cutting of regulations. And he kept saying, oh, I oversee all the cutting of regulations. We're trying to cut more regulations. And there was pushback from the panel saying, no, that's not what we're saying. That was, I guess, the crux of the commercial spaceflight panel. They talked a lot about, really the opening remarks that the vice president gave sort of set the theme as being about innovation, but the panelists said, we can't really innovate if we don't have a clear set of rules to play by. And Blue Origin, SpaceX, and Sierra Nevada Corporation are doing some great things, but there is sort of this legal regulatory gray area that they can't get past sometimes when they're trying to make these innovations, and streamlining those regulations and maybe adding more to sort of help them understand where commercial spaceflight fits in this entire international regime. That was another thing that they talked about, was how they make the regulatory process in the United States the international standard. Because you could very well see, SpaceX is talking about terrestrial flights from New York to Shanghai. That's at least 2 airspaces that they're going to be flying through if, you don't have to, have a layover flight in, I don't know, Berlin or something. That's then 3. There's a lot of different regulatory frameworks around the globe, and being like a way that the U.S. can, I guess, gain ground. That was another theme that was prevalent throughout all of the vice presidents and cabinet members' remarks, was that the U.S. has ceded ground in the last 25 years, which is, I think, both at least in space, an unfounded, unsourced claim on their part. But they're the ones in charge, so you kind of just let them talk sometimes. That part of the way the U.S. can gain ground is by leading the charge internationally as well, that we need international partners. And this goes to something in the civil space panel, was there was a lot of talk about the Deep Space Gateway. They never called it the Deep Space Gateway. That is an important thing to note. But they were saying that or the guy from Orbital ATK was making a lot of points about this, that the next 5 years, basically, are going to be important for cislunar space exploration. Cislunar space is just the area around the moon, including the moon. From Orbital ATK, what he was saying was that within 5 years, we could have SLS flights, regular SLS flights, to the Deep Space Gateway, again, not mentioned, but assumed. And that could involve commercial exploration of the lunar surface. When the topic of international cooperation came up then, the Vice President and Rex Tillerson, Secretary of State, both were pretty adamant that international cooperation was not even on the table, that the real situation that we find ourselves in is one of international competition, that we have to beat everybody. U.S. is the only ones that can do it. And then you saw pushback from some of the panelists saying, no. We need international partners. It allows us to, one, do that diplomacy, but then also it reduces some of the significant costs that the commercial companies have to bear. If you have a company in France, or you have a company in China, or not that NASA's working with China, but that you have companies around the globe working on similar problems, and you're just getting more minds on the same problem. Yeah, it might cost more in the long term,
companies,
but
it's not just the companies; it's the international agencies too. Look how much ESA has contributed to a number of our missions. Imagine Cassini without the Huygens probe, or imagine JWST without some of the scientific instruments that it's putting on board. A lot of that stuff comes from the international arena, and we share the costs, we share the data, and we all benefit from it. I'm curious to. I don't think that their lack of statements are going to effectively make it so that NASA only focuses on things where we're the only ones contributing to missions. Because I think even Bridenstine would have something to say about that, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Because he actually understands it, he understands the NASA space and understands that, if you wanted us to do that, even if you raised our budget, I don't think that we would be able to come up with the same quality products as just if we had the international cooperation necessary to do so. So yeah, I don't think that even if the attitude in the room was that we wouldn't be getting a significant amount of international help, it's going to happen anyway. You can't do space without international aid. I'm sorry, you just can't. Yeah. So.
Yeah. And that, I guess, I think we might be railing on the administration. I'm railing on the administration quite a bit recently. But I think when it comes to space, there is an expectation that anyone involved knows something about it, when a lot of these, other than Jim Bridenstine, who is not even a member of the cabinet yet, he's not even a member of the cabinet yet. He's really the only one in that room that might be holding that level of position that really knows anything about this. Mike Pence is an enthusiast. I'm sure Rex Tillerson and Elaine Chao and Mick Mulvaney, I'm sure they all really like space, but none of them know space policy. So they're implementing the White House policy and interpreting that for space. What is MAGA policy mean in space? And that's no international cooperation, beat the Chinese, beat the Russians, and innovate.
Once again, though, I think with more understanding, they'll get to the point where, perhaps they'll want to do it with minimal international cooperation. But what it will be is that NASA is leading the charge over over our international friends. I think they just have to kind of adjust to the idea of that.
Yeah, and I don't think they're used to that. They're used to the idea of taking what should be the Secretary of State's job and giving it to the president or another member of the cabinet. But including NASA in that, I think there's going to be a bit of growing pains there. And I guess the other thing, you can read all about how they want to, that we're going to the moon now. We're not going to Mars directly. It is important to note that they did not even mention when we would go to Mars. In previous iterations of space policy discussions, members of the administration, or both this administration and the previous one, have been saying 2033, 2035. This is the first situation in which they have not mentioned the 2030s. So that doesn't necessarily bode well for getting humans to Mars by that time. But what this does mean is that there's going to be a renewed sense of support for deep space exploration, even if that is just of the moon. There were even conversations in this commercial space panel of extending the ISS to 2030, which is looking more and more like what NASA is going to be going with, even though reports say 2028 is the furthest we should probably extend it for the safety of the crew. That low Earth orbit and cislunar orbit are going to sort of be split priorities for NASA. Low Earth orbit to a lesser extent, but still maintaining the ISS will be in part a NASA responsibility. It is a national laboratory. If the Deep Space Gateway becomes a national laboratory as well, we're going to see the NASA trying to do stuff with that and maintaining that. I guess my final major takeaway, and this is sort of the thing that you saw across all three panels, was that, and I think it was, let me see if I can get this quote right. Okay, I'm not seeing it here. Well, I think it was Dennis Muhlenberg that was saying, he's from Boeing. He was saying, pardon if I butcher the quote, but he was saying the only way that we can get to be number one again is if we have the resources and the funding for NASA, which doesn't seem to be the administration, the vice president, and the members of NSPOC did not particularly agree or disagree with that, or say that they. I mean, granted, they're also not members of Congress and don't set the budget, but they didn't seem to comment too much on that, even though it was brought up like 15, 20 times. The panelists saying we need a significant boost to the budget as well as consistent budgets. I mean, there was a point in which multiple panelists were railing against the sequester, budget caps, and yearly planning for the NASA budget, saying that the only way that we can get boots on the moon, boots on Mars, is if we start thinking long-term and strategically. They also kept mentioning 5-year increments. They were saying we can get to the moon in 5 years. We can get here. It was Blue Origin. The representative from there was saying that they can implement Blue Moon, which is their lunar lander idea. They can start implementing that in 5 years. What's in 5 years? That's theoretically the beginning of this administration's second term. So that gives them an extended a shortened opportunity window, saying, hey, you got to do this year, like starting this year, invest in NASA, invest in NOAA, invest in these government agencies that the commercial sector so desperately need to succeed in this mission of making America a spacefaring nation again, even though we are. But that was the theme, right? Was that the U.S. has lagged behind and we need to catch up. And I guess if that's the rhetoric that we have to go with, that's the rhetoric we have to go with. If that's what's going to get us to the moon and to Mars, is by saying, if we don't do this now, China and Russia are going to do it. And then suddenly we only hold 80% of the share of what's in space, whereas right now we basically own space. I mean, we're the most technologically adept spacefaring nation. And the fear is that soon we won't be the only one. So yeah, I guess that's my takeaway. I thought it was a great introduction. Another thing of note, just for looking into the future, there was a conversation about what recommendations the panelists should give to NSPOC. There was conversations about, the vice president was saying, oh, can you get us a memo about this or information about what you would like to see in this particular policy issue area? And a couple of the panelists, said, we need to know what the due date is. Like, when is the second meeting? Which has been a huge, I guess one of the biggest uncertainties about this whole National Space Council thing is how often are they going to meet? And we've talked about this before, Newton, that if they don't meet frequently, that means that space is not a high priority. If they meet very frequently, that means they want to do something. The answer we got, and this is not substantiated by anything else but what the vice president said, but 45 days.
Wow.
So in the next month and a half, we could see another Space Council meeting, and that would put it roughly around, mid to late November or early. I guess no, that's early December. Late November, early December.
It's about late November. It's late November.
Yeah. So I mean, assuming 45 days is 45 calendar days, that puts it late November, maybe early December, but. Again, this is one of those things that we don't have a lot of clarity on, that the administration needs to clear up for us.
Yeah, well, we will see what happens. I mean, we're taking a lot from a single event. Obviously, and we talked about this in previous weeks. This is something where they wanted to just make clear what some of their priorities are. even if some of those things may not have been stated in the best in the best of ways. I think that things like even the international cooperation angle, I think that'll get clarified over time. Of course, we can't do space without international cooperation, and it may have just been our purview given what we've heard from the administration in the past. So we'll have to wait and see in order to get that. I'm interested in the feedback that they'll get from the industry now that they're sort of soliciting that, and the different agencies now that they're soliciting that, and what they have to say in 45 days. So we'll have to see. Anyway, moving on to international news. And, this is another big piece of news. It was actually a contender for the Space News Highlight of the Week. And this is NASA's James Webb Space Telescope to be launched now in spring 2019. It's been delayed. It was, up until last, or about a week and a half ago, it was scheduled to be launched in October 2018. Now it's looking more like March or June of 2019. So the space agency made the announcement after a new scheduled assessment, noting that the delay was due to the component integration and testing was taking longer than it expected. So what I kind of wanted to do was do a little bit of a walkthrough of where we've been with James Webb and sort of how we got here. I think we've talked ad nauseum about what James Webb is, what it means for our future. It's Hubble on steroids, the Hubble of our time, things like that. But I figured I'd just kind of walk you through a little bit of the timeline of the James Webb Space Telescope. So it originated in 1996 under the Next Generation Space Telescope program, NGST. That was its original name. In the year 2000, a program called Nexus was planned as an in-space technology risk reduction experiment, and it was and as a precursor to NGST. So this was the risk reduction to do a number of experiments to just take risks off the table for this space satellite. And the Nexus had an anticipated launch date of 2004, but due to the lack of funding, the Nexus program was canceled in December of 2000. Nevertheless, in the course of the project, a detailed integrated model of the precursor space telescope was developed. So out of that canceled Nexus telescope, we were able to at least get a design and an integrated model of what JWST would look like and what we would work towards. In the year 2002, an $824.8 million prime contract for NGST was awarded to TRW to start working on the mission critical design. Now the telescope was renamed from NGST to the James Webb Space Telescope subsequently in September 2002. And then fast forward it to January 2007, after years of design and requirements gathering and debates on funding, we had 9 out of 10 technology development items pass a non-advocate review. April 2010, the technical part of mission critical design review was passed. So these are all the sort of steps that you have to go through to at least to be able to build the product, right? And this is with prototypes and smaller components already built. But these are the steps that you have to go through to ensure the government and prove to NASA, as well as in some cases Congress, that this thing will work and we will see the benefit of it. Following it passing Mission Critical Design Review, MCDR, in July 2011, the James Webb project was actually threatened with cancellation. The cost of the observatory had soared from an initial estimate of $1.6 billion to more than $6.5 billion. And as a result, budgets for other astronomical research projects had been slashed. And it actually led to some folks describing James Webb as the telescope that ate astronomy. I believe that was how one article in the journal Nature described it. And after that budget fight in 2011, it actually survived the overall cancellation attempt. But this is when NASA budgets were being slashed like crazy. In November 2011, it survived that cancellation attempt. So they continued working on it. And then we started getting scientific instruments built. So in May 2012, MIRI or mid-infrared instrument was the first scientific instrument that was handed off by ESA. This is what I was bringing up earlier, just in terms of other organizations giving us things like scientific instruments, building those kinds of things, while we handle sort of the main operations space and the flight dynamics of the craft and so on and so forth. So MIRI, or once again mid-infrared instrument, is an instrument on James Webb that has a camera and a spectrograph that observes mid-infrared radiation from 5 microns to 28 microns. So just a certain that's just describing the lengths of the length of the waves that it can observe. It also has coronagraphs, especially for observing exoplanets. Once in space and on the JWST, MIRI will operate at those infrared wavelengths and at an extremely low temperature of negative 266 degrees Celsius, just 7 degrees Celsius above absolute zero. The low temperatures are required to keep the instrument's own infrared emission from overwhelming the faint signals from astronomical targets of interest in the distant universe. So what's the point? It will be capable of penetrating thick layers of dust obscuring regions of intense starbirth. It will see galaxies near the beginning of the universe, and it will study sites of new planet formation and the composition of the interstellar medium. So that was its first science instrument. Its next one it came about in March 2013. The FGS NIR-ISS was installed in its integrated science module. The FGS, the fine guidance sensor, allows Webb to point precisely so that it can obtain high quality images. So it's just it's basically a way of pointing, getting fine, high precision, high accuracy field of view, so that you're pointing at specifically the section of or window of the universe that you want to look at. The other one, the NIR-ISS, the Near Infrared Imager and Slitless Spectrograph, that really needs a better acronym, NearSpec, I guess they're calling it. That'll be used to investigate the following science objectives. So first, light detection, then exoplanet detection and characterization, and exoplanet transit spectroscopy. So that combined instrument, FGSS, FGS is something different. FGS, NearSpec, has a wavelength range of 0.8 to 5.0 microns, and is a specialized instrument with 3 main modes, each of which address a separate wavelength range. But it really helps to have that FGS part, the guider, which helps point the telescope. So after FGS was that was actually the first one that was installed. MIRI was delivered first, but FGS NearSpec was installed first. Then MIRI was installed on July 4th, 2013, after successfully passing several cryo tests. March 2014, NearCam was installed. This one's a fairly simple one, the near infrared camera on Webb's primary imager, and that'll actually cover the wavelength range of 0.6 to 5 microns. NearCam will detect light from the earliest stars and galaxies in the process of formation, the population of stars in nearby galaxies, and the young stars in the Milky Way and Kuiper Belt objects. So we'll be pointing it in that direction. That was integrated into the integrated science module on March 24th, 2014. I'm sorry, that was March 2014. NearSpec was in March 2014 as well. NearSpec was built for the European Space Agency by Airbus Industries, with the micro shutter array and detector subsystems fabricated by NASA. The near infrared spectrograph, it's a near infrared multi-object dispersive spectrograph capable of simultaneously observing more than 100 sources over a field of view. That will be the first spectrograph in space that has that capability. And targets in the field of view are normally selected by opening groups of shutters in a micro shutter array, so just a large number of shutters to form multiple apertures. So all of these things sort of ingesting and processing these signals all at once. NearSpec will address all four of JWST's main science themes. It will also enable large spectroscopic surveys of faint galaxies at high redshift, obtain sensitive spectra of transiting exoplanets, and image line emission from protoplanetary disks and protostars. So in June 2014, the first combined tests of all of those instruments, including cryogenic testing, was done in the Goddard Space Environment Simulator. Jack, I think we got a peek of that when we did an actual tour at Goddard.
Yep. Yeah, that was April, because that was just after they put on the last mirror that we saw the whole thing.
Right. That was, April 2015, was that? I believe so.
No, that was April of last year, April 2016.
Was it? Wow.
Yeah.
Why does it feel like so long ago? Anyway, moving on. So in 2014, peak U.S. funding hit with $650 million for that year alone. So just that was how much was spent on Webb alone in that year. And that a lot of that was due to manufacturing difficulties, which plagued major elements of the actual telescope itself. It forced prime contractor Northrop Grumman to rebuild key structural elements declared unfit for flight, while continuing to grapple with a persistently problematic cryogenic compressor needed to keep JWST's infrared sensors cold. So now we're starting to get into sort of the manufacturing issues and issues with the mirror and those things surviving the environment. The science instruments are built and tested, so it can theoretically do what it says it does. Now we're working on it surviving the cold vacuum of space. So in December 2015, the contract for JWST's launcher was signed. February 2016, hexagonal segments of the primary mirror were completed. March 2016, cryogenic testing of instruments and mirrors were completed. Also, the secondary mirror was installed on OTE. Also in March 2016, aft optics subsystem was installed on OTE. In November 2016, the construction was completed. We didn't get a chance to talk about this news, but this was something that was heavily discussed, actually between some other folks in the Planetary Society. So January 2017, JWST there was a statement that came out saying that it was fine after experiencing an anomaly during vibration testing back in December 2016. In May of this year, it was shipped off to Texas. I believe we did cover that story when that occurred. And then September of this year, about a week and a half ago, it was announced that they would actually be delaying the flight to 2019. According to Thomas Zurbuchen, the Associate Administrator for NASA's Science Mission Directorate at the agency's headquarters in Washington, D.C., he said that the change in launch timing is not indicative of hardware or technical performance concerns. Rather, the integration of the various spacecraft elements is taking longer than expected. So, that's reasonable.
They're just taking longer so that the spacecraft is safe. I'm perfectly okay with my tax dollars going to that.
Yeah, fine. I mean, obviously this is a hypercritical project. We spent billions of dollars on this project. I think this is something that we're going to want to be able to fly safely. My guess is the engineers, the testers, their confidence is just not high enough in this. So I'm perfectly fine waiting even another year for this for this thing to actually be properly tested, vetted, and launched off to space. So
yeah. And it also gives us more time to plan our overseas voyage.
All right, yeah, that's very true. That's very true. So
to buy our boat.
So what's going to happen now is technicians will unpack the telescope and install it inside a thermal vacuum chamber at the Space Center, and then pump air out of the test facility as helium and liquid nitrogen chills the hardware to a temperature colder than negative 370 degrees Fahrenheit or about 50 Kelvin. The delay is at least partly due to the size and complexity of the Webb spacecraft and Sun Shield, according to the memo by the agency. So we'll see what happens with this. We'll keep paying attention to James Webb. James Webb is one of the most important launches of our time. So we'll have to we'll have to wait and see where that goes. On to a quick latest in tech. JPSS-1, so the Joint Polar Satellite System, NASA is hosting Media Accreditation Day on November 1st for this system. Basically, what that means is a chance for the media to come in, assess the spacecraft, ask questions, so on and so forth. We've talked about JPSS a bit in the past, basically saying that this is one of those systems that we don't want to go away, and that we certainly want follow on for. It's the first in a new series of 4 highly advanced NOAA polar orbiting satellites. So this one's actually going to be operated by NOAA. Its purpose is that it's supposed to help increase weather forecast accuracy from 3 to 7 days out. And it's scheduled to be launched on a ULA Delta II rocket from Space Launch Complex 2 at Vandenberg Air Force Base in California on November 10th, 2017. NOAA's the JPSS-1 arrived at the Air Force Base on September 1st, 2017 to begin prep for that November launch. After its arrival, it was pulled from its shipping container, and it's actually being prepared for encapsulation on top of that rocket that will take it to a polar orbit of about 512 miles above the Earth. It will be known as NOAA 20 after it reaches orbit and has a 7-year design life. NOAA partnered with NASA to implement the JPSS series of U.S. civilian polar orbiting environmental remote sensing satellites and sensors. So this is something that's very important for gathering data for both agencies. And we will. So one of the things that was in a previous budget items for Congress was whether or not to fund JPSS 3 and 4. We talked about that a little bit, and I believe it was in the skinny budget where that wasn't included at all. Where those programs were going to get, where the idea was that those programs were going to get slashed. Jack, do you remember all the way back to like April of this year?
Yeah, but that was one of our first episodes. Yeah, I think JPSS was one of the, I think there were 5 different satellites that they were.
Well, there was PACE. That was certainly on the chopping block.
Yeah, that was, I think, the biggest one out of all of them. But I think there were 4 or 5. Well, there were 4 total, and there was a 5th one that was sort of maybe they'll cut it, maybe they won't. And I think that 5th one was JPSS, if I remember correctly. Where they were threatening to cut it. Granted, just to reiterate, the president does not make the budget. The president recommends a budget, and generally Congress says. I mean, this has been the case for many a year now. Congress gets the proposed budget, says thank you very much, throws it in the trash, and gets to work on their own budget. I mean, so they will certainly take some things into consideration, but generally it's not.
So yeah, JPSS-1, like I said, it's a polar orbiting satellite. The follow-up will be JPSS-2, so that you can sort of get a not a larger field of view, but more higher availability observation of the poles and weather forecasting in general. That one, I believe, is scheduled for 2022, with JPSS 3 and 4. Obviously, this is completely tentative, but scheduled for 2026 and 2031. So we will, we'll see. We'll keep an eye on where that goes. Hopefully, they'll have a successful launch in November, and this is the beginning of a whole new journey in Earth-based observation. So Jack, in our coming soon to space, what's the update?
So we are recording this. We are recording this at 9:28 p.m. on Monday night. I have the Vikings-Bears game. Refreshing it right now. It's some sort of
sports ball game,
sports ball thing with 2 mascots. One a bear, one a Viking. But so they are in the second quarter with about 8.5 minutes left, which means that there's probably still 20-25 minutes of the game left. The trailer for The Last Jedi is coming out during halftime. I don't know if that's right at halftime or if it's a couple commercials in. So I don't think we're going to be able to do our live reaction quite yet.
But you'll hear about.
You will hear about this you'll hear about this for like months leading up to The Last Jedi, and then it suddenly becomes Last Jedi Theories. So we will soon become a Star Wars podcast for a little while at least.
So yeah, so we'll keep you posted on things like that. Also, don't forget to vote on the design contest. We'll have a Facebook poll up and ready for that. Also, don't forget to give to the Red Cross, globalgiving.org, or Airbnb, or to do whatever you can for airbnb.com/disaster if you're in any of those areas. Folks are still really struggling and need help, even though the news cycle is slowly getting over that. Those folks will be struggling for a long time. So,
Newton, we have the best listeners because they do everything that we recommend that they do, right?
That's very true.
They submit t-shirt designs, they're going to vote on t-shirt designs, and they're going to donate money to the Red Cross and other relief organizations that are helping people affected by the most recent hurricanes. Like, come on, you guys are awesome. Keep doing it.
Yep. We love you guys. All right.
Well, I guess other than that, I have nothing else. More analysis coming to you next week as we tackle the major issues that come up this week. So, as always, I'm Jack.
And I'm Newton.
Ad Astra.